Now, while Biden's State of the Union address was underway, there was also a press conference from the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg. It followed the national accounts data today, which showed annual economic growth for 2021 was 4.2%. You can see it here. And also growth for the quarter in December, or rather to the December 31 quarter, was 3.4%. Let's pick up just a little of Josh Frydenberg talking about the growth story.
As New South Wales and Victoria came out of lockdown, we saw a particularly strong result. So you understand, in the December quarter, for the first 10 days of the December quarter, New South Wales was still in lockdown. And Victoria was still in lockdown for the first 21 days of the December quarter. So we did see particularly strong results in New South Wales, but also in Victoria.
Yeah, there's the Treasurer explaining the story of the states as they were reopened. Let's bring in here Richard Yetsenga, Chief Economist of the ANZ Bank. Richard, thank you for your time. There is a part of the story here, but it's got something else to do. When those borders were open, when the restrictions were taken off, the people were prepared to spend their savings, weren't they?
This has been quite an unusual downturn, and we've had a couple of elements to it, but the stimulus has been so good. Households have been able to build deposits. When the restrictions go or the pandemic eases, people are very keen to spend.
And so that was seen very much in New South Wales and Victoria. Once the state borders were open, once they could see restrictions coming off, the household savings ratio dropped quite notably from where it's been during this pandemic.
It did. Nationally, it's still nearly 14%, so still very high, much higher than pre-pandemic. And of course, New South Wales and Victoria were kind of first into Omicron and first out of Delta as well. And so that they're kind of leading a little bit, I suppose.
Okay, but we're still talking the best quarterly growth number since 1976. So, it is a little unprecedented, but you would have to argue as more of the nation was opened up, there is potentially more of that to come.
There's been a bit of stop-start. Best quarterly growth number since 1976. In the last 2 years, we've had the two largest GDP falls in history. So if you smooth it out a bit, the economy is still doing very, very well. 3% in the quarter probably overcooks it a bit, really.
Okay, but then you've got other aspects. You've got a bumper crop coming in agriculture. We heard that from ABARES earlier this week. You've got, again, potentially more employment coming if the unemployment rate drops into the threes. And we know that the government, with its budget, gets half of its money from PAYE taxpayers. So the government's got, if you like, a small, unique opportunity here to do a little bit of budget repair if it chooses.
Look, the next stage is definitely budget repair, but you're right. If you look across the economy, exports doing well, rural sector doing well, consumption quite strong, fundamentals very, very strong for consumption, I think. Business investment expectations elevated. The fiscal part probably does need to start to pull back, but everything else really kicking along very, very well.
Okay, but the risks are there still, because if the Russia-Ukraine situation affects the global economy somehow, oil prices being the most obvious one, as we were just talking to Vivek about, that's the big issue, that's the big question mark that hangs over even the Australian economy.
There's always risks both ways. I think right now, Russia-Ukraine, obviously a terrible humanitarian story, and there are some things there which could have some real global economic implications. The lesson of the past couple of years, though, has been, look, you need to build resiliency against some of these events, but actually things can go very right as well. And as a business, you need to be prepared for that as well. I think the global fundamentals are still pretty good, actually.
Okay, so if we go to the Reserve Bank now, it had a forecast for 2021, the calendar year, of 5% versus the number of 4.2% that's come out. It's overshot the mark. It still says it's going to be 5% annual growth by June 30 this year. Now, clearly what we've seen this week doesn't change its outlook for interest rates for the time being. In many ways, it gives it a chance to sit on its hands like it preferred to do. But it's what happens next with the labour markets that's the key, more than anything else, for the Reserve Bank, isn't it?
Look, it has been the key. I think, though, if you think about the bank's inflation forecast, which is ultimately where its responsibility lies, its most recent round of forecast revisions revised up inflation forecast by 1 percentage point for the middle of this year. It's acknowledged Russia is going to pressure that even more. The clock is ticking. The bank says they want to be patient. They have been very patient. they'll hike this calendar year at some stage. I think probably the third quarter, but it could happen, a little bit earlier.
There's one thing that's not noted by many people, and that is the last time that oil prices were above $100, that you had iron ore prices up around about $150 US a tonne. You had an Australian dollar at $1 US. Right now, our dollar's sitting around 71, 72 US cents given the day. What is it that's keeping our currency, what seems to be artificially low right now? Because that's providing the nation with a significant boost.
Let's remember, Ross, when it was parity with the US dollar, a lot of people said artificially high, but I take your point. There's a couple of things going on. Probably the most important one is interest rates here are basically at zero. In the US, they're basically at zero. The market's betting the US will hike first and go more quickly. Certainly the first part of that is true. I'm not sure about the second part. The Reserve Bank, once they start, they've got a bit of ground to make up.
And so that would be the time when maybe the dollar plays a bit of catch up with the US dollar when those rate rises start to come.
I think so.
Because that seems to me to be the only difference between now and, say, for example, going back to 2007, 2006, 2007, when the dollar did get above $1 US.
Look, as a potential tourist who wants to use some of his long service leave, I wouldn't mind the Aussie dollar being a little bit stronger. As an economist who looks at Australia, thinking that, wow, it'd be great if we get even more people in jobs, if we get even stronger income growth, the currency being a little bit weaker than maybe the fundamentals suggest, not a bad thing either.
Okay, so right now, just briefly, how do you assess Australia's economy? Is it in great shape, good shape?
It's in great shape.
Great shape.
Great shape.
Tell you what, it's going to be fascinating just to see what plays out over the next little period of time. Richard Yetsenga, Chief Economist with the ANZ Bank. Great. Thanks very much for coming in. We appreciate your time.